This lecture is a very brief introduction to psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was founded by Sigmund Freud. Freud lived from 1856 to 1939. Freud believed that people could be cured by making conscious their unconscious thoughts and motivations, thus gaining insight. The aim of psychoanalysis therapy is to release repressed emotions and experiences. In other words, the goal is to make the unconscious conscious. Freud was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis. So again, psychoanalysis is a clinical method for treating psychopathology through dialogue between a patient and a psychoanalyst. These photos on the right here were taken on a trip to London in 2018. And this is actually Freud's house / office / museum now. And then this was his office space, right? So usually the patient would lie down on this couch, and then the psychoanalyst, Freud in this case, would sit here in this chair. And there really wasn't much dialogue between the patient and psychoanalyst. It was mostly the patient just sort of, getting out all of their thoughts and feelings. And the psychoanalyst would sit here and sort of make notes and try to analyze, what these things mean. Freud was born to Jewish parents, and so he had to flee Austria to escape Nazi persecution. Therefore, he died in exile in the UK. His creation of psychoanalysis was at once a theory of the human psyche, it was a therapy for the relief of its ills, and an optic for the interpretation of culture and society. Despite repeated criticisms and attempted refutations of Freud's work, his theories have remained powerful well after his death and in fields far removed from psychology. And the reason I appreciate psychoanalysis so much is that I really do think that it gives us a very interesting and compelling lens through which to view, certain aspects of human nature and our psyche. He wrote the personality theory in 1923, and many of you might be familiar with this, but Freud believed that the human psyche was structured into 3 parts. So there's the id, the ego, and the superego. And I really like this visual here. So, you can think of the id as the devil on one shoulder, right? The superego, the angel on the other. So the id represents our instincts. It's our primitive, impulsive, chaotic, unconscious part. It includes all of the inherited aspects of personality present at birth. So when you think of a child or a baby is all about I want, right? That they come into this world and they're extremely selfish, and not to bash children, but they're selfish, right? That they are only interested in immediate gratification. And then you have to teach children that that's not how reality works, right? That, you're not always going to be immediately gratified, that you sometimes have to wait, and that your desires aren't always appropriate. The superego is the other side of that, right? The superego embodies our morality. So these are the values of society which are learned from one's parents or other authority figures. And the superego develops between the ages of 3 to 5. And what the superego does is it controls the id's impulses, especially those forbidden by society, so things like sex and aggression. And it also persuades the ego to turn to more moralistic goals rather than just realistic ones. So it consists of the conscience and the ideal self. Okay, so it's the I should. And then finally, we have the ego here in the middle. And the ego represents reality, or what is realistically expected from us. So it mediates between the unrealistic id and the external world. It considers social norms and rules and deciding how to behave. So the ego, it's how you determine, how you're going to behave realistically, that lives up to society's expectations of you. So it is the I will. Freud also believed that the human mind consisted of 3 levels, right? So we have the conscious mind, which is up here, and he liked to think of this as an iceberg. So if you'll notice that the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is the conscious level, but that's just the tip, right? So the conscious level consists of our thoughts and our perceptions. The subconscious level is just, slightly immersed in the water here, right? And these are our memories and stored knowledge. So the subconscious, the information that lives there might be like someone asks you what your dad's birthday is. That might be something that's not necessarily up here, so it's not readily available, but it's easily accessible. That, okay, you take a second to think about it. Oh yeah, my dad's birthday is, June 17th. So these are things that are stored here, but that are easily accessible. We can easily recall. And then down here we have the unconscious level. And notice how large this is in relation to the subconscious and the conscious. And you'll notice the kinds of things that are stored in our unconscious. So it's fears, violent motives, unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, shameful experiences, selfish needs. So all of these things lie just below the surface of our awareness, right? But that even though these kinds of things might not be accessible consciously, they still, or Freud believed that they still have an influence over our current behavior. So all of our instincts and urges are contained here. So all of our id-like instincts, right, are contained here in the unconscious. Screen memories. This was an essay that Freud wrote in 1899, and this is what is referenced in the article that I had you read last week. So the definition, it's a recollection of early childhood that may be falsely recalled or magnified in importance, and that masks another memory of deep emotional significance. So Freud would later call a screen memory a fantasy or hiding a primitive wish. And a screen memory is any memory where one aspect of it is screened out. So you're essentially screening out or blocking out something that is unacceptable to the ego. So an example I have here, an adult experiencing severe depression and anxiety, although they experienced an abusive and traumatic childhood that is most likely the root of these psychological disturbances, the client uses a screen memory and blames their issues on a minor traffic accident they experienced. By doing this, they are repressing or minimizing the effects their early trauma had on their psyche and blaming a less traumatic event instead. So this could also be a form of displacement, right, or repression, where you don't want to confront something that was traumatic because it's painful to do so, right? A lot of us don't like doing that. So you instead substitute that with something that's less painful or less harmful to recall. Erik Erikson, so he was another psychoanalyst. He lived from 1902 to 1994. He was German-American, a developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst known for his theory on psychological development of human beings. He might be most famous for coining the phrase identity crisis. And his theories marked an important shift in thinking on personality. Instead of focusing simply on early childhood events, his psychosocial theory looks at how social influences contribute to our personalities throughout our entire lifespans. And so this is the other psychologist that article refers to, right? And so the article refers to his psychosocial moratorium. And so in ego psychology, a term to denote a time out of life during which a person can retain a fluid identity. Such a period often being a feature of early post-adolescent life in modern industrial societies, when young adults can take time out by traveling, for example, before settling into more fixed identities constrained by work and relationships. In the psychosocial moratorium, a person has the opportunity to try on multiple identities and/or roles before firmly committing to one. They also finalize their sense of ethics and morals in this stage. Erikson intended for it to be the final stage of identity development, which takes place in late adolescence. So I think this is interesting because it's considered a time out of life, right? So this is referring to late adolescence. And it's almost like you get, this pass where you can kind of, experiment with different identities or different things you want to do, and you're not going to have major repercussions or consequences yet, right? That it's sort of your time to figure yourself out, figure out who you are and who you want to be in this world. So pretty interesting. And that concludes our very brief introduction to psychoanalysis. But if you were intrigued by this stuff, I totally encourage you to do more research. I think it is fascinating. It's a fascinating lens to view, how human nature operates and how our minds operate.